In the beginning, so the story goes, there was Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman, created by God to populate the earth. But if we're to believe this account, a troubling question emerges almost immediately in the biblical narrative, one that has puzzled scholars, theologians, and curious minds for thousands of years. When Cain, the son of Adam and Eve, is exiled for murdering his brother Abel, he journeys to the land of Nod, east of Eden. And there, in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, we read something startling. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Wait, his wife? Where did she come from? If Adam and Eve were the first and only humans, and their only named children at this point were Cain, Abel, and later Seth, then who exactly did Cain marry? This question has no simple answer in the biblical text itself, leading to centuries of speculation, interpretation, and the emergence of fascinating alternative narratives. One of these narratives introduces us to Lilith, a figure who exists in the shadows of religious tradition, sometimes portrayed as Adam's first wife, a woman who refused to be subservient and was cast out of Eden before Eve was ever created. Today, we're diving deep into one of the oldest mysteries in religious literature. We'll explore the question of Cain's wife, examine the enigmatic figure of Lilith, and uncover how these stories have evolved through Jewish mysticism, early Christian writings, and ancient folklore. What we'll discover is far more complex and fascinating than the simple Sunday school stories many of us grew up with. Let's start with what we actually know from the biblical text. The Book of Genesis provides our foundational account. After Cain kills Abel out of jealousy, God marks him and sends him away. Genesis 4:16-17 tells us, "Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city." The text presents this as if it's the most natural thing in the world. No explanation, no introduction, no, "and this is where she came from." Just suddenly, Cain has a wife. For modern readers, approaching this text with a literal mindset, this creates an immediate logical problem. Traditional Jewish and Christian interpretations have typically resolved this mystery in one of several ways. The most common explanation is that Cain married one of his sisters. Genesis 5:4 mentions that Adam had other sons and daughters, though they're not named. Ancient Jewish texts like the Book of Jubilees, written in the 2nd century BCE, explicitly state that Cain married his sister Awan. The logic here is straightforward. If Adam and Eve were the first humans, then their children would have necessarily married each other to propagate the species. This solution, while addressing the logical problem, creates another issue for many believers. Incest, which is later forbidden in Levitical law, would have been necessary in the first generation of humanity. Various theological explanations have been offered for this, from the idea that genetic diversity was not yet a concern in the early generations to the suggestion that different moral laws applied in different eras of human history. But there's another possibility, one that requires us to read the Genesis account differently. Some scholars suggest that Genesis actually contains traces of multiple creation accounts woven together. In this interpretation, Genesis 1:27, which states, "Male and female he created them in plural form," might indicate the creation of multiple humans, not just one couple. According to this reading, Adam and Eve's story in Genesis 2 might be a more detailed account of one particular couple, while other humans existed contemporaneously, but aren't mentioned because they're not central to the narrative. This interpretation would easily solve the problem of Cain's wife. She could simply be a woman from one of these other human populations. However, this reading contradicts the traditional understanding that Adam was the first human and the progenitor of all humanity, a doctrine important to both Jewish and Christian theology, particularly in Paul's letters where Adam's sin is contrasted with Christ's redemption. The mystery deepens when we consider that the text seems curiously unconcerned with explaining this detail. Ancient readers apparently didn't find Cain's wife problematic. This might suggest that the original audience had a different framework for understanding the story, perhaps one that included traditions and oral histories that didn't make it into the canonical text. And this brings us to one of the most intriguing alternative traditions, the story of Lilith. Lilith is one of the most mysterious and controversial figures in religious tradition. She appears nowhere in the canonical Hebrew Bible as Adam's first wife, yet her story has persisted for millennia in Jewish folklore and mysticism. To understand Lilith, we need to trace her origins through ancient texts and examine how her story evolved. The name Lilith appears only once in the Hebrew Bible, in Isaiah 34:14, in a passage describing the desolation of Edom. The exact translation is debated, but in many versions she's described as a night creature or screech owl dwelling in wastelands. This single cryptic reference gives us little to go on, but it provided a foundation for a much more elaborate mythology. The most explicit account of Lilith as Adam's first wife comes from a medieval text called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, written sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries CE. This text, which is part satirical and part folkloric, tells a fascinating story. According to this account, God created Lilith from the earth, just as he created Adam, making them equals. But trouble began almost immediately. When Adam wanted to lie with Lilith, she refused to lie beneath him, arguing, "We are equal to each other inasmuch as we were both created from the earth." When Adam tried to compel her by force, Lilith spoke the ineffable name of God, sprouted wings, and flew away from Eden. Adam complained to God, who sent 3 angels, Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Semengeloth, to retrieve her. They found Lilith by the Red Sea, a region associated with demons in Jewish tradition. The angels threatened her, saying that if she didn't return, 100 of her demon children would die each day. Lilith refused to return, but made a bargain. She would not harm any child protected by an amulet bearing the angels' names. In this account, Lilith transforms from Adam's equal into a demoness, associated particularly with the danger to newborn children and pregnant women. This evolution reflects ancient beliefs about infant mortality, which was tragically common, and the need for protective rituals and amulets. But the Alphabet of Ben Sira wasn't creating this tradition out of whole cloth. References to Lilith-like figures appear much earlier in Jewish thought. The Talmud and Midrash contain references to female demons and night spirits, sometimes called Lilith or related names. The Dead Sea Scrolls, dating to the 1st century BCE, mention Lilith in fragmentary texts about evil spirits. Even earlier, ancient Mesopotamian texts from thousands of years before the Common Era reference creatures called Lilitu or similar names, female demons or spirits of the wind. The connection between these ancient Mesopotamian figures and the later Jewish Lilith is debated, but there seems to be a line of cultural transmission. What's particularly interesting about Lilith's story is what it represents. She's portrayed as demanding equality, refusing to submit to Adam's authority, and choosing exile over subordination. In medieval and later interpretations, this made her dangerous, demonic, an example of female rebellion against divine order. But in modern retellings, Lilith has been reclaimed by some as a symbol of feminine independence and resistance to patriarchal control. The question remains, could Lilith be connected to the mystery of Cain's wife? The connection between Lilith and Cain's wife is not explicit in ancient sources, but it emerges from attempts to reconcile these various traditions. If Lilith was cast out of Eden before Eve was created, and if she settled in the lands beyond paradise, Could she or her descendants have populated the region where Cain eventually fled? Some esoteric and mystical traditions have explored this possibility. In certain Kabbalistic texts and later folklore, Lilith is said to have mated with demons or fallen angels after leaving Eden, producing countless demonic offspring. The land of Nod, to the east of Eden, becomes, in this interpretation, a realm outside the direct divine order established in paradise, a place where other beings, perhaps descended from Lilith, might dwell. In this speculative framework, Cain's wife could potentially be one of Lilith's descendants, or another woman from a line of humans or human-like beings created separately from Adam and Eve's line. This would explain how a city could be built in the land of Nod, which requires a population, and why Cain feared that others would kill him when God exiled him. Remember, in Genesis 4:14, after receiving his mark, Cain says, "Whoever finds me will kill me." Who is this whoever? If only Adam, Eve, and their children existed, this statement makes little sense, especially with Abel dead. But if other populations existed outside Eden, Cain's fear becomes rational. The geographical detail is also intriguing. Nod means wandering in Hebrew, but it's described as a specific place east of Eden. In ancient Near Eastern cosmology, the East often represented exile, distance from divine presence, and movement away from the sacred center. If Eden represented the heart of God's ordered creation, then lands to the east might be seen as increasingly removed from that order, places where different rules applied. Some Gnostic and apocryphal texts written in the early centuries of Christianity expanded on these ideas. They often portrayed creation as more complex than the simple Genesis account, with multiple divine beings, multiple creations, and multiple human lines. While these texts were not accepted into the biblical canon, they reflect the kinds of questions early religious communities were asking. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that was influential in early Christianity, speaks of the Watchers, angels who descended to earth and mated with human women, producing giants called Nephilim. While this occurs later in the Genesis chronology, after the mention of Cain's wife, it establishes a biblical precedent for non-standard human origins and the mixing of different orders of beings. Could there be a connection between all these threads? Between Lilith's exile, the mysterious population of Nod, Cain's unnamed wife, and later traditions about fallen angels and their offspring? The canonical text doesn't support these connections explicitly, but the gaps in the narrative have allowed imaginative and mystical traditions to fill in the blanks. To truly understand these mysteries, we need to step back and consider the context in which these texts were written and compiled. The Book of Genesis, in its current form, was likely compiled during and after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, though it draws on much older oral traditions and possibly written sources. Ancient Near Eastern societies had complex creation mythologies. The Babylonian Enuma Elish, the Sumerian creation stories, and Egyptian creation accounts all feature multiple deities, cosmic battles, and complex genealogies of gods and heroes. The Genesis account, in contrast, presents a monotheistic creation, but scholars have noted parallels and possible borrowings from these earlier traditions. The Genesis narrative seems designed primarily to establish theological points that one God created everything, that humans are made in God's image, that sin entered the world through human choice, and that God maintains a relationship with humanity despite their failures. Details about where Cain's wife came from or whether other humans existed might simply not have been priorities for the authors. The story moves quickly from creation to the spread of sin to the need for redemption, and genealogical puzzles are secondary to these themes. Ancient readers would have approached these texts differently than modern literalists. Narrative gaps, chronological inconsistencies, and unexplained details were common in ancient literature and didn't necessarily trouble early audiences the way they trouble modern readers seeking historical or scientific accuracy. The figure of Lilith, as we've seen, developed over centuries through oral tradition, mystical interpretation, and folk belief. Her story represents how religious communities continue to interpret and expand upon their foundational texts, creating rich traditions that go far beyond what's written in the canonical scriptures. Medieval Jewish mysticism, particularly Kabbalah, developed elaborate cosmologies and mythologies that greatly expanded on biblical narratives. In these traditions, every detail of Scripture was believed to contain hidden meanings, and the gaps in the text were seen as invitations to deeper understanding. Lilith became a significant figure in these mystical systems, representing aspects of the divine feminine that were problematic or dangerous, and serving as a contrast to Eve and later to the idealized figure of the Shekinah, God's feminine presence. In contemporary times, both the question of Cain's wife and the figure of Lilith have taken on new dimensions. Biblical scholars approach the Cain's wife question through literary and historical criticism, seeing it as evidence of multiple source documents woven together, or as a reflection of ancient storytelling conventions that didn't prioritize the kind of explanatory detail modern readers expect. For those who read Genesis as literal history, various apologetic explanations continue to be offered, most commonly that Cain married a sister not mentioned by name in the text. Some point to Genesis 5:4, which mentions Adam had many other sons and daughters, and suggest that the genealogies in Genesis focus only on the line leading to Noah and eventually to Abraham, while leaving out many other people who lived. Lilith, meanwhile, has experienced a remarkable cultural renaissance. Feminist scholars and artists have reclaimed her as a symbol of female empowerment, a woman who refused to accept subordinate status and chose independence over submission. In this reading, her demonization in traditional text reflect patriarchal anxiety about women who step outside prescribed roles. She appears in countless works of modern literature, art, and popular culture, from C.S. Lewis to Neil Gaiman, from True Blood to Supernatural. In some neo-pagan and goddess spirituality movements, Lilith is venerated as a divine feminine figure, stripped of her demonic associations and celebrated for her strength and independence. The psychological interpretation of Lilith has also been influential. Some Jungian analysts see her as representing the shadow side of the feminine psyche, the repressed aspects of female sexuality and power that patriarchal cultures have sought to control. In this framework, Lilith represents what happens when natural human traits are demonized rather than integrated.
These stories raise profound theological questions. If we take the traditional Christian doctrine of original sin seriously, which depends on all humans descending from Adam, then the question of Cain's wife becomes significant. Paul's theology in Romans relies on the idea that death entered the world through Adam's sin and that all humanity inherits this fallen nature. If other humans existed who weren't descended from Adam, this theology becomes more complicated. Different Christian traditions have approached this differently. Some maintain strict literal interpretation, accepting that early humans married siblings. Others adopt more allegorical or literary readings, seeing Genesis as theological truth expressed through ancient narrative forms, rather than as modern historical or scientific reporting. The Catholic Church, for instance, while affirming that Adam and Eve were real individuals and the parents of the human race, allows for various interpretations of exactly how the Genesis narratives should be understood, recognizing both the theological truth they convey and the literary forms in which that truth is expressed. Jewish tradition has generally been more comfortable with multiple interpretations existing simultaneously. The concept of pardis in Jewish hermeneutics recognizes 4 levels of meaning in Scripture: literal, allegorical, comparative, and mystical. In this framework, the question, "Who was Cain's wife?" might have different answers at different levels of interpretation, and that multiplicity is seen not as contradiction, but as richness.
So, where does this leave us? Who was Cain's wife? Was Lilith real? Do these stories tell us something true? The honest answer is that we don't definitively know who Cain married. The biblical text doesn't tell us, and the various explanations, that she was his sister, that she was from another human population, that she was somehow connected to Lilith or other traditions, remain in the realm of speculation and interpretation. What we can say is that these questions have generated remarkable traditions, from ancient mysticism to modern feminism, from theological speculation to literary imagination. The gaps in the Genesis narrative have become spaces for human creativity and meaning-making. Perhaps the mystery itself is valuable. These unexplained details remind us that ancient texts come from contexts very different from our own, that they weren't written to answer all the questions modern readers might ask. They invite us to grapple with complexity, to recognize that religious traditions are living, evolving things, not static and frozen. The figure of Lilith, whether we see her as mythological, symbolic, or somehow historical, has resonated across millennia because she represents something profound about human experience. The tension between equality and hierarchy, the question of what we're willing to sacrifice for independence, and the ways societies often demonize what they fear or can't control. The mystery of Cain's wife reminds us that even our most foundational stories contain puzzles and gaps. We can approach these with fundamentalist certainty, demanding that every detail makes sense on a literal level. Or we can approach them with curiosity and humility, recognizing that ancient wisdom often comes packaged in forms that require interpretation, that resist simple answers, and that reveal their depths only to those willing to sit with mystery. In the end, perhaps these ancient stories are doing exactly what they were meant to do, not providing us with a detailed historical record of the early days of humanity, but giving us narratives that help us grapple with timeless questions about human nature, our relationship with the divine, the origins of sin and suffering, and the complex dynamics of gender, power, and freedom. The mystery remains, and maybe that's exactly as it should be. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of the oldest and most intriguing puzzles in religious literature. Whether you're a believer, a skeptic, a scholar, or simply someone fascinated by the stories that have shaped human culture, I hope this journey through the legends of Cain's wife and Lilith has given you new perspectives to consider and new questions to ponder. If you're interested in more content like this, check out the video I'll link in the description about the Nephilim and the Watchers, or the one exploring other contradictions and mysteries in Genesis. There's so much more to uncover in these ancient stories than we ever learned in Sunday school. Share this video with someone who loves biblical mysteries, ancient mythology, or just asking the questions that don't have easy answers. Let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember that the best stories are often the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.